Hello, welcome to Skype Academy Presents. My name is Scott Stubberfield. I'm a Principal Program Manager here at Microsoft, and today I want to talk to you about Tenant Dial Plans. Today I want to walk you through a journey called Garth Has a Bad Day. Garth works for a company called Contoso. Contoso has decided to move their traditional PBX system to Skype for Business Online. Garth's company has been doing a lot of planning and preparing in order to deliver this new Skype for Business Online service to Garth and replace his traditional desk phone. Garth is looking forward to coming into work on Monday morning because he has been promised that his traditional desk phone is gone and it will be replaced with Skype for Business Online. Garth sits down at his computer and is excited to get started. As you can see, Garth has started up his Skype for Business client and dialed the number string 555-1234. This is the exact behavior that Garth would have used previously in his phone that sat on his desk. As you can see in his Skype for Business client, unfortunately, this number has incorrectly normalized to +1 555-1234. When Garth hits enter to dial this call, the call fails and he gets connected to the diagnostic announcement service. This is a service that we implemented in Skype for Business Online to let users know that they had tried to dial a number incorrectly. In this case, Garth did try and dial a number incorrectly. Garth tried to dial the number correctly, but it just didn't normalize to the number that he expected. Most users don't understand this, and they wouldn't even catch the fact that the number normalized to something that they didn't expect. Garth is sad. He wishes he could dial numbers like he used to. We need to make Garth happy again. There are 3 simple things that I want you to take away from today's session on Tenant Dial Plans. First, Tenant Dial Plans create support for tenant-based dial plans in Skype for Business Online. These tenant-based dial plans allow you to create custom normalization rules, and these rules and dial plans are applicable to a specific user or to an entire tenant. Let's keep these 3 simple things in mind as we proceed throughout today's session, and we'll touch base on them again at the end.
Before we move on to today's detailed agenda, I wanted to provide a few brief disclaimers related to this training. This session was recorded in April 2017. The features and functionality that you see in it are current as of that date. Because Office 365 is constantly undergoing innovation, the new features and functionality that are added will be updated in these trainings as they come online. We recommend to you that you go to the aka.ms links shown on the screen to always get the latest up-to-date version of this and other trainings.
Let's have a look at what we're going to talk about today. Using the Skype operations framework, we'll break down tenant dial plans into 3 main components. We'll talk about how to plan, how to deliver, and how to operate tenant dial plans. So what exactly are tenant dial plans, you ask? Well, before we talk about what they are, let's talk about why we created them. Firstly, we created tenant dial plans to make Garth Forth happy again. We didn't like that Garth was sad, and we wanted to make him happy again. Okay, I'm just kidding. No, so really, we created them based on overwhelming customer feedback. And this customer feedback said to us that a single country-specific set of dialing rules wasn't enough. Customers that have been migrated to Skype for Business Online have been asking for a way to mimic the behavior that they had in on-premises deployments in their new online deployments. They felt that user dial patterns had to change when users were migrated from on-premises deployments to Skype for Business Online. As a result, this change in dialing behavior dramatically impacted the end user experience when moving to this new Skype for Business Online system. So what are they? They're dial plans that are created in your Skype for Business Online tenants. They enable users to dial the way that they're used to. This means that a user no longer needs to dial a regional or area code when dialing in Skype for Business Online. Each dial plan uses a set of normalization rules similar to what we used for on-premises deployments. I'm not going to go into a lot of details on what normalization rules are, number patterns, and how you do translations. I will give a very simple example later, as I assume that you're already very familiar with normalization rules. If not, there's lots of training and readiness out there that you could find that digs into these in more depth. These tenant dial plans apply to cloud PBX users who are in an online or in a hybrid state, as well as users that are using dial-out for cloud PSTN conferencing. There are currently no changes in routing or phone usages as a result of tenant dial plans. It's literally just a client-side number normalization thing that's changing. The last thing to remember is that there is a limit of 25 normalization rules per dial plan. If your customer currently has more normalization rules per dial plan, they would need to readjust these plans. Perhaps they could split them out into multiple different dial plans that would then be assigned to different groups of users. Before we introduce tenant dial plans, each country or region that a user was hosted in Skype for Business Online contained a set of very basic normalization rules. On the screen here, you can see an example. We've run the commandlet get-cs dial plan, and we've set the region to US. And we've taken a look at the normalization rules that are associated to that US region's dial plan. As you can see, there's a very limited subset of normalization rules that are being used. So keep this in mind as we go through the rest of this presentation. Dial plans have always existed in online. They're assigned to the users. They were just very basic and didn't meet the dialing needs of most of our users. With the introduction of tenant dial plans, we now have 3 different types of dial plans that we support in Skype for Business Online. The first type of dial plan is a service dial plan, and this was shown on the last screen, and the example that I showed there was the US region for the service dial plan. This dial plan has always existed and been applied to users, and it can't be changed. There was no way that you could turn it off even if you wanted to, or you couldn't change any of the rules that existed in it. With the introduction of tenant dial plans, we now have 2 subset types of dial plans that can be created at the tenant level. The first one is what we consider to be a tenant global dial plan. This dial plan would apply to all users in a specific tenant. The second type is what we call tenant user dial plan. This dial plan only applies to a specific subset of users that have explicitly been granted this dial plan via their tenant administrator. Now that we talked about the 3 types of dial plans that we have, let's have a look at how these dial plans work together or in combination of one another. So the important thing to remember here is that dial plan scope or hierarchy works differently in Skype for Business Online tenant dial plans than it did in Skype for Business on-premises dial plans. On-premises dial plans were previously based on a hierarchy of global, site, pool, and user, in which we would apply the most specific or lowest level plan in the hierarchy. So for example, if I assigned a pool level dial plan as well as a site level dial plan, only the rules that were in the pool level dial plan would apply to a user that was hosted on that pool. We would essentially ignore the site level dial plans. When using tenant dial plans, we do this a little bit differently in that we actually merge together 2 different types of dial plans together to come up with an effective dial plan that is then applied to a user. These effective dial plans fall into 3 different categories that you can see on this slide. The first type is shown in the first column. In this case, we have no tenant global dial plan, nor do we have a user dial plan assigned to a particular user. In this case, the only dial plan that would apply to a particular user would be the service country dial plan for the region that that user's tenant is in. The second column shows the situation where we have a tenant global dial plan, but no user tenant dial plan assigned. In this case, we will merge the rules from the service country dial plan together with the tenant global dial plan. And then lastly, on the right-hand side is an example where we have a tenant user dial plan assigned. In this case, we will ignore the tenant global and we will merge together the tenant user dial plan with the service country dial plan to create the effective dial plan for the user. In a couple of slides upcoming, I'll show you PowerShell commandlets that you can use to see or predict what these merged dial plans will look like, as well as in the operate phase, I will show you a specific example that shows what this looks like in a SIP log on the user's client. Now that we've discussed why we created tenant dial plans and given you a little bit of information about what they are and how to configure them, let's dig into some of the planning steps that you would want to look at to go about figuring out which dial plans you need. The first step is you need to decide if additional rules are actually required. You can use the commandlet get-cs effective dial plan for a particular user, which will show you the default rules that are applied to that user. If those rules are sufficient, nothing else is needed and you don't need to complete steps 2, 3, and 4. For a majority of the time, though, this won't be sufficient because, as we discussed before, the rules for the service or country are pretty basic. In step 2, you decide which dial plan type is required. The easiest type of dial plan that you could create at this point is a tenant global dial plan. This tenant global dial plan would be assigned to all users that share that same tenant as long as they share the same requirements. If you have groups of users that are in different locations that have different dialing requirements, you would create a tenant user scope dial plan at this point and assign that tenant user scope dial plan to those specific users. In step 3, you would go through and identify the valid number patterns for each dial plan. In this training, we won't go into any depth on how to create those valid number plans because there's lots of training out there, including all of the on-premises training that we've published in the past that talks about how to determine number plans, test them, and validate that they're working. Lastly, in step 4, this is more of a recommendation than really anything you need to determine, but the recommendation is to maintain consistency in dial plan names. And what we mean by this is that if you create dial plans into your tenant, those tenant dial plans should be something specific to the region or location or area or function for which you're creating a tenant user dial plan. By doing this, if you have multiple tenant administrators, people will know on the surface what the tenant dial plan's purpose is. In the previous slide, on step number 3, we talked about creating your valid number patterns. On this slide, we wanted to give you some examples of how you could identify what these valid number patterns are. If you have an existing on-premises deployment, that's probably the best starting point to go and look at to determine which rules you need. My one caveat here, though, would be to make sure that the normalization rules that are defined there are actually required. It's possible that someone had created some rules previously in your on-premises deployment that aren't actually needed by the end users that are being assigned them. So I would just validate that all the rules that have been set up are actually needed. If they are, you can take and export the rules out of this existing on-premises deployment and import them into your new online deployment. We have a couple of slides coming up that show you a way that you can run a script to do that. In addition, if you're migrating from a traditional telephone system, you would want to go back and look at the rules that you collected during the project envisioning phase. Put these into an import file and then import those rules into Skype for Business Online.
Before we move on to looking at how to implement this in your environment, we wanted to discuss a few caveats related to the feature. The first caveat is related to how this is configured. As of right now, the only way to configure tenant dial plans is through the use of PowerShell commandlets. There is currently no UI-based configuration for tenant dial plans. However, this is something that we have planned in the future. The second caveat is around support for the external access prefix. This was something that was available in dial plans in our on-premises product, but it is not currently available with tenant dial plans. Again, this is something that we're investigating, delivering, and will be coming out in the near future. The last caveat is related to certified IP phones. The current specification that was written for these phones did not include support for tenant dial plans, as this feature didn't exist at the time the spec was written. Our current plan of record from a design perspective is to update the spec and fully support this feature on our certified phones in the future.
Now that we've talked about what tenant dial plans are and the planning steps that you would go through to configure them, let's go ahead and look at how you would actually configure these in Skype for Business Online. This slide shows you a series of outcomes in the left-hand column of this table. In the right-hand column of the table, we show the corresponding syntax that you would need to run in order to achieve that outcome. Let's take a look at these. The first one is where we would create a new dial plan and add normalization rules to that dial plan. The first commandlet that you would want to run is new-cs tenant dial plan. This would create a dial plan in the system called dial plan for Redmond. We give it an identity and a simple name. At this point, there are no normalization rules added to that tenant dial plan. The next thing that we must do is create a new normalization rule. And as you'll see, we're creating this normalization rule in memory as a variable. We give it a description. In this case, I'm calling it 7-digit local dialing. I'm adding the corresponding pattern that's required and the translation rule. And as you'll see, we're looking for 7 digits, and then we're translating that by adding +1425 to the beginning of those 7 digits. In the example that we showed earlier, where a user had dialed 7 digits and that call failed to connect, this would resolve that problem. We would take the 7 digits the user had dialed, append the correct country and area code to those 7 digits, and we would send the call off to be processed. Lastly, we run the commandlet set-cs tenant dial plan and point it to the normalization rule that we just created in memory, and this will add that normalization rule to the tenant dial plan. Once we've done that, we need to grant the tenant dial plan to a specific user. And we do that using the syntax shown in the second row of this table. We run the commandlet grant-cs tenant dial plan. We point it to the garthf@contoso.com identity. And we choose the policy name, Redmond Dial Plan, which was the dial plan that we just created in the previous step. When we do this, Garth will be assigned a tenant user dial plan that has the normalization rule that we just created called 7-digit local dialing. If we wanted to test and verify this using PowerShell, we can run the commandlet shown in the fourth line on this table, get-cs effective tenant dial plan. We send this commandlet Garth's identity, in this case garthf@contoso.com, and what we would get in return is a list of normalization rules that are part of the effective tenant dial plan that's being defined for Garth. If you remember back to the slide that showed the 3 different types of merged dial plan options that we could have, this is effectively that third column on the right-hand side, which is where we merge the service or country dial plan for Garth's tenant along with the tenant user dial plan that we just created. If we wanted to take this one step further and actually test that a number dialing pattern would actually normalize correctly, we can run the commandlet that's shown in the fifth line of this table. And that's where we run the same get-cs effective tenant dial plan, but in this case we're piping that result to a commandlet called test-cs effective tenant dial plan, in which case we've specified the number 5551234. The corresponding output would show that the number that we had dialed had normalized correctly based on the normalization rule that's in the tenant user dial plan that we just created. Lastly, I wanted to call out the line that's in the last line of this table. That commandlet is called set-cs tenant hybrid configuration. That uses a parameter called use on-prem dial plan. We must set that to false if we want our hybrid users that we've set up in Skype for Business Online to consume tenant dial plans. Let's have a look at this in action. We're back with Garth at his desk, and he's dialed the number 5551234, which is incorrectly normalized to +1 5551234. Our soft partner that we're working with has suggested the following changes. And really this is just a combination of the 2 outcomes that show how to create a new dial plan, add a normalization rule, and then grant that dial plan to the user Garth. Now, Garth is signed out, signed back in, and when he receives his new normalization rules, he's able to dial 5551234, and it correctly normalizes to +1 425 555 1234. Garth is happy again. Now that we've looked at how to create a new dial plan and add some normalization rules, let's look at a few outcomes in which you may want to change a tenant dial plan. So the first option that you have is to delete a tenant dial plan. And to do this, you would run the commandlet remove-cs tenant dial plan, specify the identity, and use the commandlet option -force. What this does is this forces the removal of the tenant dial plan, even if it's already assigned to a user. If you don't use the -force option, you will be prompted if any of your users have been granted this tenant dial plan, in which case you can accept to delete the dial plan, or you can choose no to not delete the dial plan. We recommend that you probably don't do this and that you remove or ungrant the dial plan from any users prior to deleting it, but you could go ahead and force it anyways. If perhaps you wanted to remove a normalization rule from a tenant dial plan, you create a normalization rule in memory with the same name of the normalization rule that you want to remove from a dial plan, and then you run the commandlet set-cs tenant dial plan, specifying the identity of the dial plan and passing it the normalization rules parameter, in which case you would then remove the variable $NR1, which we created in the first line. This is essentially the opposite of what we do when we add a normalization rule, where we're saying add a normalization rule that we've created in memory. Lastly, I've copied again the commandlet that shows how to view the normalization rules associated to a particular tenant dial plan. In this case, you run get-cs tenant dial plan, specifying the name of the dial plan. You put this in round brackets, and at the end, you type .normalization rules, which will show you and expand the list of normalization rules that are in that dial plan. It is possible to capture your on-premises dial plans and create an input CSV to use for bulk creating the tenant dial plans in your tenant. In the example shown below, we've shown a simple CSV file that lists the dial plan name, the description, if this is an internal extension, the number pattern, and the translation. You can then use this CSV file and the script shown on the screen here to automatically import the rules from the CSV file into your online dial plan. We won't go into this in too much more depth, as we consider this to be a slightly more advanced topic, but we wanted to give you an example of what was possible. Now that we've talked about what tenant dial plans are and how to create them, let's look at some of the operate functions that you may want to take on them. In order to analyze your logs, there's a couple of steps that you're going to want to go through to be best prepared to look at a client log file. Sure, you could just open up the client log file using Snooper, jump into it, and go right to where you wanted to. But we wanted to give you an idea of what exactly you should be looking for. So the first thing that you want to do is run the commandlet get-cs effective tenant dial plan, specifying Garth's identity. Pipe this to select identity and you'll get just the identity field back. You then open up the client log file using Snooper, shown on the screen there where that client log file is located, and search for the description location profile description. You should see many messages in your client log file that match location profile description. And really what this is this is just the location profile or dial plan, as we call them, being sent down to your user. On this screenshot, we've shown the before and the after. The before was when Garth was signed in to Skype for Business Online, and all he was assigned was the service or country dial plan for his tenant's region, in this case, US. In the after screenshot, you can see that we've now sent an effective dial plan that has a string, a GUID that ends in dial planned for Redmond _US. And what this is this is the effective dial plan that the system has combined, which combines the US dial plan and the dial plan that we created for Redmond into one dial plan and sent it down to Garth's client. As you can see, the names between the two don't match exactly, However, the GUID part that in this case starts with B822 does match to what we showed in the commandlet on the previous slide. We wanted to give you a few links that showed you some additional information on tenant dial plans. The first link around planning tenant dial plans, and the second link is around creating and managing tenant dial plans. The information provided in this training session should be sufficient to get you started, but once you've gone through this, I suggest you look at these two links as there are some additional details that might be of interest to you. Let's recap some of the key learning points that we talked about in today's session. Tenant dial plans are our first support for tenant-based dial plans in Skype for Business Online. In these tenant dial plans, you can create custom normalization rules, so you're not stuck with using normalization rules that are system-based. You can create whatever you want. And these dial plans can be applied to a specific user or to an entire tenant. Thank you for your time today in joining the Skype Academy. I hope you enjoyed your training session. Don't forget, let's make Garth happy again.